The Coming Race by Edward Bulwer-Lytton. Chapter 1. The Native Wanderer. I am a native of, in the United States of America. My ancestors emigrated from England during the reign of Charles II, and my grandfather achieved some distinction in the War of Independence. Consequently, my family enjoyed a reasonably elevated social standing by right of birth, and, being also possessed of considerable opulence, they were deemed ineligible for public service. My father once stood for Congress but suffered a signal defeat at the hands of his tailor. Following that event, he intervened little in political affairs and resided principally within his library. I was the eldest of 3 sons, and at the age of 16, I was dispatched to the old country, partly to conclude my literary education, and partly to commence my commercial training in a mercantile firm at Liverpool. My father passed away shortly after I attained my 21st year, and, being left in prosperous circumstances and possessing a predilection for travel and adventure, I relinquished for a season all pursuit of material wealth and became a desultory voyager across the face of the earth. In the year 1800, happening to be in, I was invited by a professional engineer, with whom I had formed an acquaintance, to visit the depths of the mine wherein he was employed. The reader will comprehend, ere he closes this narrative, my motive for obscuring every clue to the district of which I write, and will perhaps offer me gratitude for refraining from any description that might tend toward its discovery. Permit me to state, then, as succinctly as possible, that I accompanied the engineer into the interior of the mine and became so singularly fascinated by its somber marvels, and so interested in my friend's explorations, that I prolonged my sojourn in the vicinity and descended daily, for some weeks, into the vaults and galleries excavated by both nature and art beneath the surface of the earth. The engineer was convinced that far more abundant deposits of mineral wealth than had yet been detected would be discovered in a new shaft that had been commenced under his direction. In excavating this shaft, we came one day upon a chasm, serrated and seemingly charred at the sides, as if riven asunder at some remote period by volcanic fires. Into this chasm my friend caused himself to be lowered in a cage, having first tested the atmosphere with a safety lamp. He remained nearly an hour within the abyss. Upon his return, he was exceedingly pale, bearing an anxious, reflective expression of countenance, distinctly at variance with his customary demeanor, which was open, cheerful, and intrepid. He stated briefly that the descent appeared to him perilous and conducive to no result, and, suspending further operations in the shaft, we returned to the more familiar precincts of the mine. Throughout the remainder of that day, the engineer appeared preoccupied by some engrossing reflection. He was unusually taciturn, and there resided a terrified, bewildered look in his eyes, resembling that of a man who has beheld a phantom. At night, as we sat alone in the lodging we shared near the mouth of the mine, I addressed my friend. "Tell me casually what you perceived in that chasm. I am certain it was something strange and terrible. Whatever it may be, it has left your mind in a state of uncertainty. In such an instance, consultation is superior to solitude. Confide in me." The engineer endeavored for a long time to parry my inquiries, but as he spoke, he assisted himself inadvertently from the brandy flask to a degree to which he was wholly unaccustomed, for he was a remarkably abstemious man, and his reserve gradually dissolved. He who desires to maintain his own counsel ought to emulate the mute beasts and imbibe only water. At last he spoke, "I will recount everything. When the cage halted, I found myself upon a ridge of rock, and below me, The chasm, taking an oblique direction, descended precipitously to a considerable depth, the darkness of which my lamp could not have penetrated. But through it, to my boundless astonishment, streamed upward a steady, brilliant light. Could it be any volcanic fire? In that event, surely I should have perceived the heat. Yet, if there was doubt regarding this, it was of the utmost importance to our common safety to resolve it. I examined the sides of the descent and discovered that I could venture to entrust myself to the irregular projections or ledges, at least for some distance. I quitted the cage and clambered down. As I drew nearer and nearer to the light, the chasm broadened, and at last I beheld, to my ineffable amazement, a wide, level road at the bottom of the abyss, illuminated as far as the eye could reach by what appeared to be artificial gas lamps positioned at regular intervals, as in the thoroughfare of a great metropolis. And I heard confusedly in the distance a murmur resembling human voices. I am aware, of course, that no rival miners are at work in this district. Whose could be those voices? What human hands could have leveled that road and marshaled those lamps? The superstitious belief, common among miners, that gnomes or fiends dwell within the bowels of the earth, began to seize me. I shuddered at the prospect of descending further and braving the inhabitants of this nether valley. Nor, indeed, could I have done so without ropes, as from the point I had reached to the bottom of the chasm, the sides of the rock descended abruptly, smooth and sheer. I retraced my steps with some difficulty. Now I have told you all. Will you descend again? I ought, yet I feel as if I dare not. A reliable companion halves the journey and doubles the courage. I will accompany you. We shall provide ourselves with ropes of suitable length and strength. And, pardon me, you must not drink more tonight. Our hands and feet must be steady and firm tomorrow. Chapter 2. Descent into the Abyss. With the morning, my friend's nerves were fortified, and he was no less excited by curiosity than myself. Perhaps more so, for he evidently believed in his own account, whereas I harbored considerable doubt regarding it. Not that he would have deliberately narrated an untruth, but I suspected he must have been under the influence of one of those phantasms that seize upon our fancy or our nerves in solitary, unaccustomed places, and in which we attribute form to the shapeless and voice to the silent. We selected 6 veteran miners to oversee our descent, and as the cage accommodated only one at a time, the engineer descended first, and when he had attained the ledge at which he had previously halted, the cage reascended for me. I soon gained his side. We had provided ourselves with a strong coil of rope. The light impinged upon my vision just as it had done the previous day upon my friends. The hollow through which it emanated sloped diagonally. It appeared to me a diffused atmospheric light, not resembling that of fire, but soft and silvery, like the radiance of a northern star. Quitting the cage, we descended, one after the other, with sufficient ease, owing to the protrusions in the side, until we reached the place where my friend had previously halted, which was a projection merely spacious enough to permit us to stand abreast. From this spot, the chasm widened rapidly like the lower terminus of a vast funnel, and I beheld distinctly the valley, the road, and the lamps which my companion had described. He had exaggerated nothing. I heard the sounds he had heard, a mingled, indefinable murmur as of voices and a dull tramping as of feet. Straining my vision further down, I clearly perceived in the distance the outline of some large edifice. It could not be mere natural rock. It was too symmetrical, with huge, heavy columns reminiscent of Egyptian architecture, and the whole illuminated as if from within. I carried upon my person a small portable telescope, and by the aid of this I could distinguish, near the building I mention, two forms which appeared human, though I could not be certain. At the very least they were living, for they moved, and both vanished within the building. We now proceeded to attach the end of the rope we had brought with us to the ledge on which we stood, by the aid of clamps and grappling hooks, with which, as well as with necessary tools, we were provided. We were almost silent in our work. We labored like men fearful of speaking to one another. With one end of the rope having been ostensibly secured to the ledge, the other, to which we had attached a fragment of rock, rested upon the ground some 50 feet below. Being the younger and more agile of the two, and having served at sea during my boyhood, I was far more accustomed to this method of transit than my companion. Whispering, I claimed the prerogative of the first descent, intending, once established upon the solid ground, to steady the line for his subsequent passage. I reached the bottom in safety, and the engineer commenced his own descent. However, he had scarcely traversed 10 feet when the anchorages, which we had deemed so secure, gave way, or rather the rock itself proved treacherous, crumbling under the tension, and the unfortunate man was precipitated to the base, falling directly at my feet. The impact dislodged splinters of stone, one of which, mercifully small, struck and temporarily stunned me. Upon recovering my senses, I beheld my companion lying as an inanimate mass beside me, his life utterly extinguished. While I bent over his corpse in a paroxysm of grief and horror, a singular noise, resembling a hybrid between a snort and a hiss, arrested my attention close at hand. Turning instinctively toward the quarter from which it emanated, I perceived, emerging from a dark fissure in the cliff, a vast and terrible head possessing open jaws and dull, ghastly, ravenous eyes. It was the head of a monstrous reptile, akin to a crocodile or alligator, yet infinitely exceeding the dimensions of any such creature I had ever encountered in my travels. Springing to my feet, I fled down the valley with the utmost celerity. Eventually, I halted, overcome with shame at my panic and flight, and retraced my steps to the location where I had abandoned the body of my friend. It was gone. Doubtless, the monster had already dragged the remains into its den to devour them. The rope and grappling hooks lay where they had fallen, yet they offered no possibility of return. It was impossible to reattach them to the heights above, and the precipice walls were too sheer and polished for human ascent. I stood alone in this alien world, within the very bowels of the earth. Chapter 3. A subterranean landscape. With slow and cautious steps, I pursued my solitary course along the illuminated thoroughfare toward the massive structure I have previously indicated. The road itself resembled a grand alpine pass, skirting rocky mountains of which the one through whose chasms I had descended formed a mere link. Far below to the left stretched a vast valley, presenting to my astonished gaze unmistakable evidences of art and cultivation. The fields were carpeted with a strange vegetation, analogous to nothing I have witnessed upon the surface of the earth. Its hue was not green, but rather a dull leaden shade or a golden red. There were lakes and rivulets that appeared constrained within artificial embankments. Some contained pure water, while others shimmered like pools of naphtha. To my right, ravines and defile opened among the rocks, with passes between them evidently constructed by artifice, bordered by trees largely resembling gigantic ferns, possessing exquisite varieties of feathery foliage and stems akin to the palm. Others bore a likeness to the cane plant but were taller, supporting large clusters of blooms. Still others assumed the form of enormous fungi, with short, thick stems upholding a wide, dome-like canopy from which long, slender branches either ascended or drooped. The entire panorama behind, before, and beside me, as far as the eye could reach, was brilliant with innumerable lamps. This sunless world was as bright and warm as an Italian landscape at noon, yet the air was less oppressive and the heat more tempered. Nor was the prospect before me devoid of signs of habitation. I could distinguish in the distance, whether upon the banks of lake and rivulet or situated halfway upon eminences embedded within the vegetation, edifices that must surely serve as the abodes of men. I could even discern, though remotely, forms that appeared human moving amidst the landscape. Pausing to observe, I perceived to the right, gliding swiftly through the air, what appeared to be a small vessel propelled by sails shaped like wings. It soon vanished from sight, descending amidst the shadows of a forest. Directly above me, there was no sky, only a cavernous roof. This ceiling rose incrementally higher as the landscape receded, until it became imperceptible, obscured by a haze that formed beneath it. Continuing my walk, I startled a curious animal, roughly the size and shape of a deer, from a bush resembling a great tangle of seaweed interspersed with fern-like shrubs and plants of large foliage similar to the aloe or prickly pear. However, as it turned to gaze at me inquisitively after bounding a few paces away, I perceived that it resembled no species of deer currently extant upon the earth. Rather, it instantly recalled to my memory a plaster cast I had once viewed in a museum representing a variety of the elk stag, reputed to have existed prior to the deluge. The creature appeared sufficiently tame, and after inspecting me for a moment or two, it resumed grazing upon the singular herbage, undismayed and indifferent. Chapter 4. The Sphinx-like Being. I now arrived in full view of the edifice. Indeed, it had been fashioned by hands, and hollowed partially from a great rock. At first glance, I should have surmised it to belong to the earliest form of Egyptian architecture. It was fronted by colossal columns tapering upward from massive plinths, possessing capitals that, upon closer inspection, I perceived to be more ornamental and fantastically graceful than the Egyptian style permits. Just as the Corinthian capital mimics the leaf of the acanthus, so the capitals of these pillars imitated the foliage of the neighboring vegetation, some resembling the aloe, others the fern. And now there issued from this building a form human. Yet was it truly human? It stood upon the broad causeway, looked about, beheld me, and approached. It advanced to within a few yards of my position, and at the sight and presence of it, an indescribable awe and tremor seized me, rooting my feet to the earth. It reminded me of those symbolical images of genius or demon depicted on Etruscan vases or limned upon the walls of Eastern sepulchres. Images that borrow the human outline yet belong to another race. The figure was tall, not gigantic, but equaling the stature of the tallest men beneath the height of giants. Its principal covering appeared to be composed of large wings folded across its breast and extending to its knees. The remainder of its attire consisted of an undertunic and leggings of some thin, fibrous material. Upon its head, it wore a species of tiara gleaming with jewels, and in its right hand, it bore a slender staff of bright metal resembling polished steel. But the countenance, it was that which inspired my awe and terror. It was the face of a man, yet of a type distinct from our known extant races. The nearest approximation in outline and expression is the face of the sculptured Sphinx, so regular in its calm, intellectual, and mysterious beauty. Its complexion was peculiar, more akin to that of the red man than any other variety of our species, and yet distinct, a richer and softer hue, with large black eyes, deep and brilliant, and brows arched in a semicircle. The face was beardless, yet a nameless quality in its aspect, tranquil though the expression and beauteous though the features, roused that instinct of danger which the sight of a tiger or serpent provokes. I sensed that this man-like image was endowed with forces inimical to humanity. As it drew near, a cold shudder overwhelmed me. I fell upon my knees and covered my face with my hands. Chapter 5. The Automata and the Hall. A voice accosted me, possessing a very quiet and musical tonality, in a language of which I could comprehend not a single word, yet it served to dispel my trepidation. I uncovered my face and looked upward. The stranger surveyed me with an eye that seemed to penetrate the very depths of my heart. He proceeded to place his left hand upon my forehead, and with the staff held in his right, he gently touched my shoulder. The consequence of this dual contact was little short of magical. In lieu of my previous terror, a sensation of contentment, joy, and self-assurance, as well as confidence in the entity standing before me, permeated my spirit. I arose and addressed him in my native tongue. He hearkened to me with apparent attention, yet with a trace of surprise in his expression. He then shook his head, seemingly to indicate that my words conveyed no meaning to him. He then clasped my hand and conducted me in silence toward the edifice. The entrance stood open, indeed, it was devoid of any door. We entered an immense hall, illuminated by the same species of luster as the scene without, but here diffusing a fragrant odor. The flooring was composed of large tessellated blocks of precious metals, partially obscured by a semblance of mat-like carpeting. A strain of subdued music undulated from above and around, as though emanating from invisible instruments, appearing to belong naturally to the locus, much as the sound of murmuring waters pertains to a rocky landscape, or the warble of birds to vernal groves. A figure, clad in simpler attire than that of my guide yet of a similar fashion, stood motionless near the threshold. My guide touched it twice with his staff, whereupon it commenced a rapid, gliding movement, skimming noiselessly across the floor. Upon observing it closely, I perceived that it was no living form, but rather a mechanical automaton. Perhaps 2 minutes had elapsed after it vanished through a doorless aperture, half-screened by drapery at the farther end of the hall, when through that same opening advanced a boy of approximately 12 years, bearing features so closely resembling those of my guide that they appeared evidently to be father and son. Upon perceiving me, the child uttered a cry and raised a staff similar to that borne by my guide, as if in menace. At a command from the elder, he let it fall. The pair then conversed for some moments, scrutinizing me as they spoke. The child touched my raiment and stroked my face with manifest curiosity, uttering a sound akin to a laugh, yet characterized by a hilarity more subdued than the mirth of our own laughter. Presently, the ceiling of the hall parted, and a platform descended, apparently constructed upon the same principle as the lifts employed in hotels and warehouses for ascending from one story to another. The stranger positioned himself and the child upon the platform and signaled for me to do likewise, which I did. We ascended rapidly and safely, alighting in the midst of a corridor flanked by doorways. Through one of these portals, I was conducted into a chamber furnished with oriental splendor. The walls were tessellated with spars, metals, and uncut jewels. Cushions and divans abounded. Apertures serving as windows, though unglazed, extended to the floor, and as I passed, I observed that these openings led onto spacious balconies, commanding views of the illuminated landscape beyond. In cages suspended from the ceiling were birds of strange form and radiant plumage, which, at our entrance, commenced a chorus of song, modulated into tune much like that of our piping bullfinches. An exquisite fragrance, emanating from elaborately sculptured censers of gold, permeated the air. Several automata, resembling the one I had previously witnessed, stood silent and motionless by the walls. The stranger seated me beside him on a divan and addressed me once more. I replied, yet without the slightest progress toward mutual comprehension. However, I now began to feel the effects of the blow I had received from the splinters of the falling rock more acutely than I had initially perceived. A sense of sickly faintness overwhelmed me, accompanied by acute, lancinating pains in the head and neck. I sank back upon the seat and endeavored in vain to stifle a groan. Whereupon the child, who had hitherto appeared to regard me with distrust or aversion, knelt by my side to support me. Clasping one of my hands in both his own, he brought his lips close to my forehead, breathing upon it softly. In a few moments my pain ceased. A drowsy, blissful tranquility descended upon me, and I fell asleep. How long I remained in this state I cannot say, but when I awakened, I felt perfectly restored. My eyes opened to behold a group of silent forms, seated around me with the gravity and quietude of Orientals, all bearing a resemblance to the first stranger. Possessing the same mantling wings, the same mode of raiment, the same sphinx-like countenances with deep, dark eyes and the color of the red man. And above all, the same type of race, a race akin to man's, yet infinitely stronger of form and grander of aspect, inspiring the same unutterable sensation of dread. Yet each countenance was mild and tranquil, and even benevolent in its expression. And, curiously enough, it seemed to me that within this very calm and benignity lay the secret of the dread which these countenances inspired. They appeared as devoid of the lines and shadows which care, sorrow, passion, and sin imprint upon the faces of men as are the visages of sculptured gods, or as, in the eyes of Christian mourners, seem the peaceful brows of the dead. I felt a warm hand upon my shoulder. It was that of the child. In his eyes, there was a lofty pity and tenderness, such as that with which we might gaze upon some suffering bird or butterfly. I recoiled from that touch. I recoiled from that gaze. I was vaguely seized by the conviction that, had he so desired, the child could have extinguished my life as easily as a man might kill a bird or a butterfly. The child appeared distressed by my repugnance. He withdrew from me and positioned himself beside one of the windows. The others continued to converse among themselves in subdued tones, and by their glances in my direction, I perceived that I was the subject of their discourse. One in particular seemed to be urging a proposal regarding me upon the being whom I had first encountered. The latter, by his gesture, appeared on the verge of assent, when the child suddenly abandoned his post by the window, placed himself between me and the other forms as if in protection, and spoke rapidly and eagerly. By some intuition or instinct, I sensed that the child whom I had previously so dreaded was pleading on my behalf. Ere he had ceased, another stranger entered the chamber. He appeared older than the others, though not aged. His countenance, less smoothly serene than theirs, though equally regular in its features, seemed to me to possess more of a touch of humanity akin to my own. He listened quietly to the words addressed to him, first by my guide, next by two others of the group, and lastly by the child, then turned towards me and addressed me, not with words but through signs and gestures. These I surmised that I perfectly understood, and I was not mistaken. I comprehended that he inquired whence I came. I extended my arm and pointed toward the path which had led me from the chasm in the rock. Then an idea seized me. I drew forth my pocketbook and sketched upon one of its blank leaves a rough depiction of the ledge of rock, the rope, and myself clinging to it. Then of the cavernous abyss below, the head of the reptile, and the lifeless form of my friend. I presented this rudimentary hieroglyph to my interrogator, who, after inspecting it gravely, passed it to his neighbor, and thus it circulated among the group. The being I had first encountered then uttered a few words. The child, who approached and examined my drawing, nodded as if he comprehended its purport, and, returning to the window, expanded the wings attached to his form, shook them once or twice, and then launched himself into the space without. I started up in amazement and hastened to the window. The child was already airborne, buoyed by his wings, which he did not flap back and forth as a bird might, but which were elevated above his head, seeming to bear him steadily aloft without effort of his own. His flight appeared as swift as that of any eagle, and I observed that his course was directed towards the rock whence I had descended, the outline of which loomed visible in the brilliant atmosphere. Within a very few minutes, he reappeared, gliding swiftly through the aperture by which he had departed, and depositing upon the floor the rope and grappling hooks I had abandoned during my descent from the chasm. A few words were exchanged in subdued tones among those present. One of the group engaged an automaton, which sprang into motion and glided from the chamber. Thereupon, the latest arrival, who had previously communicated with me via gesture, rose, grasped my hand, and conducted me into the corridor. There, the platform by which I had ascended awaited us. We positioned ourselves upon it and were descended into the hall beneath. My new companion, retaining his hold upon my hand, escorted me from the edifice into a thoroughfare extending beyond it, flanked by structures separated from one another by gardens resplendent with richly hued vegetation and exotic flora. Interspersed amidst these gardens, which were partitioned by low walls, or promenading slowly along the roadway, were numerous figures resembling those I had previously observed. Certain passers-by, upon perceiving me, approached my guide, evidently directing inquiries regarding my person through their tones, glances, and gestures. In a brief interval, a crowd assembled around us, scrutinizing me with profound interest, as though I were some rare, untamed beast. Yet, even while satisfying their curiosity, they maintained a grave and courteous demeanor, and following a few words from my guide, who appeared to deprecate any obstruction to our progress, they receded with a stately inclination of the head and resumed their course with tranquil indifference. Midway along this thoroughfare, we halted before an edifice differing from those we had hitherto passed, inasmuch as it constituted three sides of a vast courtyard, at the angles of which stood lofty pyramidal towers. Within the open space enclosed by these wings lay a circular fountain of colossal dimensions, ejecting a dazzling spray of what appeared to my eyes to be fire. We entered the structure through an open portal and emerged into an enormous hall, wherein were gathered several groups of children, all apparently engaged in labor as though within some great manufactory. A massive engine was set into the wall in full operation, complete with wheels and cylinders and resembling our own steam engines, save that it was richly ornamented with precious stones and metals, and appeared to emit a pale, phosphorescent atmosphere of shifting light. Many of the children were occupied with some mysterious task upon this machinery, while others were seated before tables. I was not permitted to linger sufficiently long to investigate the nature of their employment. Not a single young voice was audible, not one youthful countenance turned to gaze upon us. They were all as still and indifferent as ghosts might be, through the midst of whom pass unnoticed the forms of the living. Quitting this hall, my guide conducted me through a gallery richly frescoed in compartments, displaying a barbaric admixture of gold within the pigments, reminiscent of the paintings of Louis Cranach. The subjects depicted upon these walls appeared, to my cursory glance, intended to illustrate events in the history of the race into whose midst I had been admitted. In all, there were figures, the majority resembling the anthropomorphic creatures I had beheld, yet not all attired in the same fashion, nor all possessed of wings. There were also effigies of various animals and birds wholly alien to me, set against backgrounds depicting landscapes or edifices. Insofar as my imperfect knowledge of the pictorial arts allowed me to form an opinion, these paintings appeared highly accurate in design and rich in coloring, evincing a perfect command of perspective. Yet their details were not arranged according to the rules of composition acknowledged by our artists, lacking, as it were, a center. Consequently, the effect was vague, scattered, confused, and bewildering. They resembled heterogeneous fragments of an artistic dream. We now entered a chamber of moderate dimensions, in which was assembled what I subsequently learned to be the family of my guide, seated at a table spread as if for a repast. The figures thus grouped comprised my guide's wife, his daughter, and 2 sons. I recognized at once the distinction between the sexes, although the 2 females were of loftier stature and ampler proportions than the males, and their countenances, while even more symmetrical in outline and contour, were devoid of that softness and timidity of expression which lends charm to the face of woman as observed on the earth above. The wife bore no wings. The daughter, however, possessed wings of greater length than those of the males. My guide uttered a few words, whereupon all those seated rose, and with that peculiar mildness of gaze and manner which I have previously noted, and which is, in truth, the common attribute of this formidable race, they saluted me according to their custom, which consists of placing the right hand very gently upon the head and uttering a soft sibilant monosyllable, equivalent to welcome. The mistress of the house then seated me beside her and heaped a golden platter before me from one of the dishes. While I ate, my companions conversed quietly, and, so far as I could detect, with a polite avoidance of any direct reference to myself or any obtrusive scrutiny of my appearance. Yet, I was the first creature of that variety of the human race to which I belonged that they had ever beheld, and was consequently regarded by them as a most curious and abnormal phenomenon. However, all rudeness is unknown to this people, and even the youngest child is instructed to despise any vehement emotional demonstration. When the repast was concluded, my guide once more took me by the hand and, re-entering the gallery, touched a metallic plate inscribed with strange figures, which I rightly conjectured to be of the nature of our telegraphs. A platform descended. However, on this occasion we ascended to a much greater altitude than in the former edifice, finding ourselves in a chamber of moderate dimensions, which, in its general character, possessed much that might be familiar to the associations of a visitor from the upper world. There were shelves upon the wall containing what appeared to be books, and indeed were such, mostly very diminutive, resembling our diamond duodecimos, shaped in the fashion of our volumes, and bound in fine sheets of metal. Several curious pieces of mechanism were scattered about, apparently models, such as might be observed in the study of any professional mechanician. For automata stood, phantom-like, at each angle of the wall. Within a recess lay a low couch or bed, furnished with pillows. A window, with curtains of some fibrous material drawn aside, opened onto a spacious balcony. My host stepped out onto the balcony. I followed him. We stood upon the uppermost story of one of the angular pyramids. The prospect beyond was of a wild and solemn beauty impossible to delineate. The vast ranges of precipitous rock which formed the distant background, the intermediate valleys of mystic, many-colored herbage, the flash of waters, many of them resembling streams of roseate flame, and the serene luster diffused over all by myriads of lamps, combined to form a whole of which no words of mine can convey an adequate description. So splendid was it, yet so somber, so lovely, yet so awful. However, my attention was soon diverted from these nether landscapes. Suddenly there arose, as if from the streets below, a burst of joyous music. Subsequently, a winged form soared into the space. Then another, as if in pursuit of the first, followed by another and yet another. Others followed in succession, until the throng grew dense and the number countless. But how to describe the fantastic grace of these forms in their undulating movements? They appeared engaged in some sport or amusement, now forming into opposing squadrons, now scattering, now each group threading the other, soaring, descending, interweaving, and severing, all in measured time to the music below, as if in the dance of the fabled Peri. I turned my gaze upon my host in feverish wonder. I ventured to place my hand upon the large wings that lay folded upon his breast, and in doing so, a slight shock, as of electricity, passed through me. I recoiled in fear. My host offered a smile and, appearing to courteously indulge my curiosity, slowly unfurled his pinions. I observed that the garment worn beneath expanded, much like a vessel inflating with air. His arms appeared to merge into the wings, and in the next instant, he launched himself into the luminous atmosphere, hovering motionless with wings outstretched, resembling an eagle basking in the sunlight. Then, with the rapidity of a swooping eagle, he plunged downward into the center of one of the gatherings, skimming through the assembly before ascending once more with equal suddenness. Thereupon, 3 figures, one of whom I believed to be my host's daughter, separated themselves from the others and pursued him, much as one bird might playfully chase another. My vision, dazzled by the brilliance and confounded by the multitudes, could no longer distinguish the gyrations and aerial maneuvers of these winged companions, until my host eventually re-emerged from the throng and alighted beside me. The utter strangeness of all I had witnessed now began to affect my senses rapidly. My very mind began to wander. Although I am not prone to superstition, nor had I previously believed that humanity could enter into corporeal communion with demons, I felt the terror and wild agitation with which a traveler in the Gothic ages might have convinced himself he was witnessing a sabbat of fiends and witches. I retain a vague recollection of attempting, through vehement gesticulation, forms of exorcism, and loud, incoherent exclamations, to repel my courteous and indulgent host. I recall his mild endeavors to calm and soothe me, his intelligent conjecture that my fright and bewilderment were occasioned by the disparity in form and movement between us, a difference which the wings, having previously excited my wondering curiosity, rendered far more perceptible in action. I remember the gentle smile with which he sought to dispel my alarm by discarding the wings upon the ground, endeavoring to demonstrate that they were merely a mechanical contrivance. Yet that sudden transformation served only to heighten my horror, and as extreme fear often manifests as extreme daring, I sprang at his throat like a wild beast. In an instant, I was felled to the ground as if by an electric shock. The last confused images floating before my vision, before I became wholly insensible, were the form of my host kneeling beside me with one hand upon my forehead, and the beautiful, serene countenance of his daughter, her large, deep, inscrutable eyes fixed intently upon my own. Chapter 6. Learning the Ancient Language. I remained in this unconscious state, as I subsequently learned, for many days, perhaps even weeks according to our computation of time. Upon my recovery, I found myself in an unfamiliar chamber. My host and his entire family were gathered around me, and to my utter amazement, my host's daughter addressed me in my own language, with only a slight foreign accent. "How do you feel?" she inquired. It was some moments before I could sufficiently overcome my surprise to falter, "You know my language? How? Who and what are you?" My host smiled and gestured to one of his sons, who then retrieved from a table a number of thin metallic sheets upon which were traced drawings of various figures. A house, a tree, a bird, a man, and so forth. In these designs, I recognized my own style of draftsmanship. Beneath each figure, the name was written in my language and in my own handwriting, while below that appeared a word strange to me in a different script. The host stated, "Thus we began, and my daughter Z, who belongs to the College of Sages, has been your instructress, and ours as well." Z then placed before me other metallic sheets upon which words, and subsequently sentences, were inscribed in my handwriting, with strange characters in another hand beneath each word and sentence. Rallying my senses, I comprehended that a rudimentary dictionary had thus been compiled. Had this been accomplished while I dreamed? "That is enough for now," said Z in a tone of command. "Repose and take food." Chapter 7. The Secrets of VRIL. A private room within this vast edifice was assigned to me. It was tastefully and fancifully arranged, though devoid of the splendor of metalwork or gems displayed in the more public apartments. The walls were hung with a variegated matting woven from the stalks and fibers of plants, and the floor was carpeted with the same material. The bed was uncurtained, its iron supports resting upon spheres of crystal, while the coverings consisted of a thin, white substance resembling cotton. There were several shelves containing books, a curtained recess connected to an aviary filled with singing birds. Among them, I recognized none resembling those I have seen on earth, save for a beautiful species of dove, though even this was distinguished from our own by a tall crest of bluish plumes. All these birds had been trained to sing artful melodies, greatly exceeding the skill of our piping bullfinches, which can rarely master more than 2 tunes and cannot, I believe, sing them in concert. Listening to the voices in my aviary, one might have imagined oneself at an opera. There were duets, trios, quartets, and choruses, all arranged as if forming a single musical composition. If I wished to silence the birds, I had only to draw a curtain over the aviary. Their songs ceased as they found themselves left in darkness. Another opening served as a window, It was not glazed, but upon touching a spring, a shutter ascended from the floor. This was composed of a substance less transparent than glass, yet sufficiently pellucid to allow a softened view of the scenery outside. Attached to this window was a balcony, or rather a hanging garden, wherein grew many graceful plants and brilliant flowers. The apartment and its appurtenances thus possessed a character which, if strange in detail, was nevertheless familiar as a whole to modern notions of luxury. Indeed, it would have excited admiration if found within the residence of an English duchess or a fashionable French author. Before my arrival, this had been Z's chamber, which she had hospitably relinquished to me. Some hours after the awakening described in the previous chapter, I lay alone upon my couch, attempting to focus my thoughts on conjectures regarding the nature and origin of the people amongst whom I had been cast, when my host and his daughter Z entered the room. My host, still speaking my native language, inquired with great politeness whether it would be agreeable to me to converse, or if I preferred solitude. I replied that I should feel deeply honored and obliged by the opportunity to express my gratitude for the hospitality and civilities I had received in a country to which I was a stranger, and to learn enough of its customs and manners so as not to offend through ignorance. As I spoke, I had naturally risen from my couch. However, Z, much to my confusion, curtly ordered me to lie down again. There was a quality in her voice and gaze, gentle though both were, that compelled my obedience. She then seated herself unconcernedly at the foot of my bed, while her father took his place on a divan a few feet distant. "But from what part of the world do you come?" asked my host, "that we should appear so strange to you, and you to us? I have seen individual specimens of nearly all the races differing from our own, save for the primeval savages who dwell in the most desolate and remote recesses of uncultivated nature, unacquainted with any light other than that which they obtain from volcanic fires, and content to grope their way in the darkness, as do many creeping, crawling, and even flying creatures. Yet certainly you cannot be a member of those barbarous tribes. Nor, on the other hand, do you appear to belong to any civilized people." I felt a degree of irritation at this concluding remark and hastened to reply that I possessed the honor of belonging to one of the earth's most civilized nations. Regarding the matter of illumination, while I admired the ingenuity and lavish expenditure with which my host and his compatriots had managed to light regions unvisited by the sun's rays, I confessed my inability to conceive how anyone, having once beheld the heavenly orbs, could compare their luster to artificial lights born of human necessity. However, my host asserted that he had examined specimens of most races distinct from his own, excepting the wretched barbarians previously mentioned. Was it possible, then, that he had never trodden the earth's surface? Or was his reference solely to communities entombed within its bowels? My host remained silent for some moments. His countenance betrayed a measure of astonishment, an emotion which the people of that race very rarely manifest, regardless of how extraordinary the circumstances. Z, however, possessing a sharper intellect, exclaimed, "Thus you perceive, my father, that there is validity in the ancient tradition. Indeed, there is always truth in every tradition universally credited across all ages and among all tribes." "Z," returned my host mildly, "you belong to the College of Sages and ought to possess greater wisdom than I. Yet, as chief of the Light-Preserving Council, it is my duty to accept nothing as established until it is proven to the evidence of my own senses." Turning then to me, he posed several inquiries regarding the earth's surface and the celestial bodies. Although I responded to the best of my ability, my replies appeared neither to satisfy nor to convince him. He shook his head quietly and, abruptly shifting the topic, inquired how I had descended from what he was pleased to designate as one world into the other. I replied that beneath the Earth's surface lay mines containing minerals and metals essential to our needs and our advancement in all arts and industries. I then briefly explained how, during the exploration of one such mine, my ill-fated companion and I had glimpsed the regions into which we subsequently descended, and how that descent had cost him his life. I appealed to the rope and grappling hooks, which the child had conveyed to the house where I was first received, as evidence attesting to the veracity of my narrative. My host then proceeded to interrogate me regarding the habits and modes of existence among the races of the upper earth, particularly those deemed the most advanced in that civilization, a term he was pleased to define as the art of diffusing throughout a community the tranquil happiness inherent to a virtuous and well-ordered household. Naturally desiring to paint the world of my origin in the most favorable colors, I touched but lightly, albeit indulgently, upon the antiquated and decaying institutions of Europe. This I did in order to expatiate upon the present grandeur and prospective preeminence of that glorious American Republic, in which Europe enviously seeks its model and tremblingly foresees its doom. Selecting as an exemplar of social life in the United States that city where progress marches at the most accelerated pace, I indulged in an animated description of the moral habits of New York. Mortified to perceive, by the countenances of my audience, that I had failed to produce the favorable impression I had anticipated, I elevated my theme. I dwelt upon the excellence of democratic institutions, their promotion of tranquil happiness through the government of party, and the manner in which they diffused such felicity throughout the community by preferring, for the exercise of power and the acquisition of honors, the lowliest citizens in point of property, education, and character. Fortunately recalling the peroration of a speech regarding the purifying influences of American democracy and their destined expansion across the globe, delivered by a certain eloquent senator, I concluded by repeating its glowing predictions of the magnificent future smiling upon mankind. A time when the flag of freedom would float over an entire continent and 200 million intelligent citizens, accustomed from infancy to the daily use of revolvers, would apply to a cowering universe the doctrine of the patriot Monroe. When I had finished, my host gently shook his head and lapsed into a deep reverie, signaling to his daughter and myself to remain silent while he reflected. After a time, he spoke in a most earnest and solemn tone. If you believe, as you aver, that you, though a stranger, have received kindness at my hands and those of my kin, I adjure you to reveal nothing to any other among our people respecting the world from which you came, unless, upon consideration, I grant you permission to do so. Do you consent to this request? Assuredly, I pledge my word to it, I replied, somewhat amazed, extending my right hand to grasp his. However, he placed my hand gently upon his forehead and his own right hand upon my breast, a gesture constituting the custom among this race in all matters of promise or verbal obligation. Then, turning to his daughter, he said, "And you, Z, shall not repeat to anyone what the stranger has said, or may yet say, to me or to yourself regarding a world other than our own." Z rose and kissed her father on the temples, saying with a smile, "A Gw's tongue is wanton, but love can fetter it fast. And if, my father, you fear lest a chance word from me or yourself might expose our community to danger by inciting a desire to explore a world beyond us, will not a wave of the vril, properly impelled, wash even the memory of what we have heard the stranger say from the tablets of the brain?" "What is vril?" I inquired. Thereupon, Z commenced an explanation of which I understood very little, for there exists no word in any language known to me that serves as an exact synonym for vril. I should term it electricity, were it not that it encompasses, in its manifold branches. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.